Hey everybody, this is Mike and welcome to another edition of Healthcare Update. Well, the big news overnight was that the Freedom Caucus has agreed to some new principles for reforming the Affordable Care Act and restructuring our healthcare system. And the basic idea with this approach is what they want to do is send all of the decisions about whether to keep the Affordable Care Act, whether to get rid of it, whether to exempt out of the Affordable Care Act will be left to the states. So it's a variation of the old states' rights agreement. And so the concern with this approach, and I can see the attractiveness of this approach, put it down to the local level, but make it as small as possible, the decision making. So everybody can customize the healthcare system to what their particular people need. Well, the problem is we've seen this before, and we get into free riding problems. And that was the reason that we were getting into the so-called death spirals of costs rising, because individuals were not carrying health insurance, and so they couldn't afford to pay for their care when they needed it. This would be a variation of it at the state's level, okay? And we've seen this before to a smaller degree with the Medicaid expansions. Even with the Affordable Care Act and the level of standardization across the states, the Supreme Court allowed the states to opt out of the Medicaid expansion, and a lot of states did. So Schwartz and Summers in Health Affairs a couple of years ago looked at this issue that when a state chose to expand Medicare, did they get a lot of in-migration of Medicaid patients, rather? Or if a state chose not to expand their Medicaid, did a lot of the Medicaid patients migrate to other states that did expand it? And after a lot of statistical analysis, they found that there was not a lot of migration, and they could detect down to about 1,500 people migrating per state, and they really didn't see any migration between states. But what the Freedom Caucus is proposing is a lot different, because Medicaid patients are by definition poor, right? So a couple of issues come to mind. If you have people who are on the individual markets, they're small business owners, for example, or independent contractors, they very well may have the resources to migrate where the Medicaid patients don't. Also, another issue that concerns me is what about the large healthcare systems within these states that choose to opt out of the provisions of the Affordable Care Act and disinvest within in their healthcare systems? Will we see migration of some of the healthcare systems, for example? Suppose Minnesota chooses not to invest in healthcare, and they say, we're just going to opt out of all this ACA stuff. Would the Mayo Clinic consider moving a lot of their resources to their other facilities in Scottsdale, Arizona, or down in Florida? And see a lot of the jobs move out of Minnesota. It's similar to the tax inversions that the pharmaceutical companies were doing, and created quite a problem. So it'll be interesting to see. It's not even clear whether the rest of the House is going to accept this approach. If the rest of the House accepts the approach, it's not clear at all whether the Senate will accept this approach. So there's a long way to go, but it's an interesting idea. This whole idea of the economy being dependent on healthcare jobs was reviewed in the Sunday New York Times by Chad Terhune, using some research from Kaiser Family Foundation. And he notes that since we've seen this dramatic shift in how jobs are created since the 2008 recession, and our job growth has been based on healthcare jobs, okay? So everybody wants to cut down healthcare spending, but remember the inverse of that is getting rid of healthcare jobs, is cutting jobs growth. To give you an idea of what this looks like pictorially, look at here's the in the red line. Here's the hit from the 2008 recession. Healthcare jobs kept growing. Where, you know, if you look at this slope here and then this slope here, we haven't even returned to the other industries. We haven't even returned to the previous job growth levels. So, you know, we need to be very careful and thoughtful about controlling healthcare costs. We're cutting people's jobs. Healthcare spending for one person is their income for their families, for another person. CMS put out their ACA stabilization rules, and this was very interesting, you know, because there was a lot of concern there would be a dramatic change through regulations or similar to the way Mr. Trump is using executive orders. But CMS, you know, it comes across as being fairly reasonable, you know, and really fairly productive. They're going to shorten the enrollment period to 6 weeks rather than 3 months. They're going to tighten up the special enrollment rules. Now, you know, you have this enrollment period, and that sets your health insurance for the rest of the year. You're not supposed to have the ability to change it, but the ACA allowed for special life events, and including whether you moved or whether you got divorced or had a baby or got married, and there were many others. Well, under the previous administrations, they weren't really checking or verifying people's status. They made a claim for a life event and they didn't check it very carefully. Well, now they're going to check it. You got to provide documentation. Some people also were gaming the system. For example, health insurance companies couldn't drop you for a missed payment unless you missed for 3 months. So what some people were doing was they would make their last payment in September. They wouldn't pay October, November, and December. And then with the new re-enrollment period, they would get new insurance. And under these new market stabilization rules, you have to pay any outstanding previous premiums before you can get new health insurance, which seems reasonable, and some actuarial flexibility. And all this means is, remember the metal levels where, you know, for example, silver, a silver health plan has to cover 70% of your anticipated health costs for the next year. Well, you know, previously the CMS would allow insurers some variation within that. It didn't have to be exactly 70%. It could vary between 68 to 72%. Now they're going to let it vary from 66 to 72%. So, and finally, the new regulations suggest that they're going to be committed to continuing the outreach. Now remember, and I talked about this before, every time an ad run that you broadcast a commercial on television, for example, every time you do 800 of these broadcasts, you get almost another 2,100 people enrolling. So the advertising has been shown to be effective. So this is good news. Finally, second to the last, rather, the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments on a biosimilar review pathway. The biosimilar approval pathway is not working very well. Only 4 biosimilars have been approved, so they're making some technical adjustments to this. Now, as you recall, a lot of our pharmaceutical products previously used to be fairly inert, large molecules. Now we're getting into an age of biologic products where these pharmaceutical products are the result of biological processes. So, for example, they'll train a bacteria to produce a protein, which then they then give to patients. Biosimilars are generic products for these biologic products. And so we're still figuring this out, you know, how, you know, so for example, one of the things here in number 2, the biosimilar producer has to work with the original developer to share the IP. So they have to work fairly hand in glove, which there's really no motivation for the original producer to do that. High drug prices continue to be a problem. New York has a very aggressive approach where they're creating a drug utilization board to control pharmaceutical spending. That is really fairly controlling, fairly rigid. I've worked under these systems before, under these schemes. And they can be pretty clunky and difficult to understand what's happening in the marketplace. I'd be happy to talk about that sometimes. Finally, Maryland is proposing new rules to penalize pharmaceutical manufacturers for large increases in their health care, in their prices they charge. This seems to be aimed at the generic manufacturers. So, a lot of interesting things going on this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week.